The wind had teeth tonight. It bit at the high plains, a ceaseless, keening sound that scraped over the grasslands and tore through the sparse stands of pine. It was a lonely sound for a lonely land, a place of immense sky and unforgiving earth. Here, in a shallow basin hidden by folds of ancient rock, a circle of men stood against the dark. Fire was their only anchor to the world. The flames clawed at the blackness, a churning heart of orange and red that threw long, dancing shadows. The men who formed the circle were shadows themselves, their faces hard plains of light and darkness. They were silent, their stillness a testament to the gravity of the moment. In their hands, they held spears, the iron heads, hammered and honed, drank the firelight and held it in a dull, hungry gleam. Feathered tufts tied below the points shivered in the wind. The only soft things in a circle of hard edges. The air smelled of wood smoke, sweat, and the cold, clean scent of sagebrush carried on the gale. A stir at the edge of the circle broke the tableau. Two warriors, broad and grim, shoved a man forward. He stumbled, catching his balance on the packed earth just shy of the fire's heat. He did not fall. This was the stranger, Ronan Pike. He was tall, built of the lean, hard muscle that came from a life lived in the saddle. His clothes were dust-caked and worn thin at the knees and elbows. A dark felt hat, its brim stained with sweat and trail dirt, was gone, likely lost in his capture. His hair was the color of dried wheat, darkened by grime and matted in places. A fresh, angry cut slashed across his left cheekbone, a raw line of red that had bled and begun to dry. He squinted against the sudden glare of the fire, his eyes a pale, startling blue the color of a winter sky. They moved constantly, not with fear, but with a hunter's assessment, cataloging the faces, the weapons, the lay of the land. He was cornered, but he was not yet broken. The circle closed behind him. He was an island in a sea of hostility. One of his captors, a man with a jaw like a block of granite, stepped forward. His voice was a low growl, rough as gravel. He was found near the gray crag, the warrior said, the words clipping off in the cold air. The language was not one Ronan understood with his mind, but the tone was universal. Accusation, judgment, riding west, tracking, another elder, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, spoke from his place near the great chief. The soldiers are camped 2 days from the crag. They search for the pass. The granite-jawed warrior pointed a thick finger at Ronan. He is their eyes, a spy. The word, spy, needed no translation. It hung in the air, heavy and venomous. A murmur rippled through the circle, a low, dangerous sound like the growl of a wolf pack. Hands tightened on spear shafts. The men shifted their weight, their bodies tensing. They had seen what the soldiers did, what the wagons and the iron rails brought with them. They had been pushed from the green valleys to this high, hard country. A spy was not just an enemy. He was a harbinger of the end. Ronan's jaw was tight. His gaze never left the warrior who accused him. He understood his position perfectly. He was a white man found in their territory, near a place of strategic importance. He had a tracker's tools on his saddle, a rifle in its scabbard, and a face they had no reason to trust. His life was now balanced on the edge of a knife, and the slightest breeze could send it tumbling into the abyss. He had been in tight spots before, but this felt different. This was not a saloon brawl or a dispute over a card game. This was older, a judgment passed down from the land itself. The fire popped, spitting a shower of embers toward the stars. In that brief, crackling silence, a new figure emerged from the shadows behind the chief's seat. It was a woman. She moved with a liquid grace that defied the harsh landscape. The firelight caught the intricate beadwork on her doeskin dress and the single eagle feather woven into her long, black hair. She walked past the elders, her moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth, and stopped just inside the circle of spears. This was Tala. She was the chief's daughter, but she wore no air of privilege. Her bearing was one of quiet strength, her shoulders straight, her chin held high. Her face was beautiful, not in the soft way of the women in the eastern towns, but with the stark, compelling beauty of the canyons and mesas. Her features were carved with a fine precision, her skin the color of warm copper. But it was her eyes that held the night. They were dark, so dark they seemed to pull the firelight into them and give nothing back. They were like obsidian sharp, ancient and unreadable. She did not look at her father or the accusers. Her gaze fell directly on Ronan Pike, and it was as steady and unnerving as the land itself. There was a signal, a slight dip of the chief's head, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. A soft, sibilant sound whispered through the air, the sound of leather sliding against calloused palms, of polished wood shifting in unison. As one, 100 spear points were lifted. They rose from the ground, a forest of iron thorns, their tips aimed not at Ronan, but at the star-dusted sky. It was not an attack. It was a question posed to the spirits, a ritual of judgment. The circle was now complete, a cage of men and weapons. The air grew thick, heavy, charged with the electric potential of imminent violence. The tension was a physical thing, a high, thin note that vibrated in Ronan's bones, tightening the muscles in his back and neck. It was the taut silence before a lightning strike. Tala's expression did not change. Her dark eyes remained locked on Ronan's pale blue ones. The firelight flickered between them, a frantic, shimmering veil. In that long, suspended moment, the world outside the circle ceased to exist. There was only the wind, the fire, and the silent conversation passing between the chief's daughter and the condemned man. For Ronan, there was only the cold certainty of his end. He had lived by a simple code: ride hard, shoot straight, and never expect tomorrow. It seemed tomorrow had finally run out of road. But for Tala, the present was suddenly invaded by the past. The image of the man before her, bruised and cornered in the firelight, dissolved. For a heartbeat, she was no longer in the council circle. She was back in the sun-drenched canyon from that afternoon, the air thick with the scent of hot dust and juniper. She saw him not as a spy, but as he was then, a man leaning against a rock, his gun holstered, his expression not of aggression, but of weary resignation. She heard the scrape of his boot on stone, saw the way the light caught the lines of exhaustion around his eyes. She felt again the shared, fragile silence of that hidden place, a moment of understanding that had passed between two people who should have been enemies, a moment that had changed everything. The memory vanished as quickly as it came, leaving its echo behind. The circle of spears still pointed to the heavens. The faces of the warriors were still set like stone. Her father, the great chief Neosi, watched her, his gaze heavy with the weight of his people's survival. He had given the signal. The judgment was all but past. Tala drew a slow, deliberate breath. The wind whipped a strand of her black hair across her face, and she did not brush it away. Her eyes, fixed on Ronan, held a depth that no one in the circle could fathom. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it cut through the wind and the crackling of the fire with the clarity of a striking bell. She said 4 words: "He rides with me." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier and more profound than the quiet that had come before. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. The 4 simple words fell into the tense arena and shattered the certainty. They were a shield, an impossible declaration that stood against the unified will of the council. Slowly, uncertainly, heads turned. Warriors looked at one another, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. They looked to the chief's daughter, standing resolute and unmoving. Then, they looked to their chief. The spears did not lower. They remained pointed at the sky, 100 questions hanging in the balance. The warriors waited. The life of the stranger was no longer in their hands. It had been taken from them by 4 words. Chief Neosi did not move. He sat like a figure carved from the mountain itself, his face impassive, his eyes, which had been on his daughter, now shifted to Ronan Pike. He studied the stranger with an intensity that seemed to peel back skin and muscle, to look directly at the man's soul. He had led his people for 50 winters. He had seen liars and heroes, cowards and fools. He had learned to read the truth not in words, but in the flicker of an eye, the set of a jaw. The fire spit and hissed. A log collapsed in on itself, sending a fresh plume of embers spiraling into the infinite darkness. The crackling sound was the only clock counting the seconds of a man's life. The chief's daughter had thrown down a challenge, a claim that defied all logic and law. She had vouched for a man who represented the very threat they had gathered to extinguish. Why, the question hung unspoken in the cold night air. A hook baited with the life of one man and the honor of another. Why would the daughter of the chief risk everything for a white stranger with the mark of his enemy's violence still fresh on his face 3 days earlier? The air had been thick with dust and the smell of stale cigar smoke. Ronan Pike stood in the cramped office of the Cattlemen's Association in the raw-boned town of Redemption. The room was little more than a box, its pine walls sweating resin in the afternoon heat. A film of yellow grit covered every surface. Across a scarred wooden desk sat 2 men who embodied the new order of the West. The first was Jedediah Thorne, a rancher whose hands were as soft as his belly, his wealth measured in acreage and longhorn cattle. His face was florid, his breathing a constant, wheezing effort. He was a man accustomed to getting what he paid for. The second was Deputy Marshal Vance, a man whittled down to sinew and suspicion. He wore his badge pinned to a clean leather vest, his gun belt cinched high and tight. His eyes were small, colorless chips of granite that missed nothing and trusted less. Thorne pushed a piece of paper across the desk. It was a list, written in a surprisingly neat hand. They hit my supply wagon 2 nights ago, on the old pass, heading for the South Range camp. Ronan picked up the list. He didn't look at the men. He looked at the words. Flour, 20 sacks, needles thread, 6 spools, assorted sizes, morphine, 1 crate, bar iron, 10 lengths, salt, 5 sacks. He set the paper down. His movements were economical, wasting nothing. He rolled a cigarette from a pouch of cheap tobacco, his fingers deft and sure. He struck a match on his thumbnail and drew the smoke in deep, his pale blue eyes squinting. Odd list for rustlers, he said, his voice a low rasp. Dry as the dust outside. It ain't rustlers. Vance cut in, his tone sharp. It's him, the one they're calling the Copper Mask. Hits freight, hits supply lines. Melts back into the hills before a posse can even get their boots on. Stole 3 of my best horses last month, Thorne added, dabbing his brow with a silk handkerchief. Didn't even touch the cattle, just the horses, a side of bacon, and a box of blasting powder. It makes no sense. Ronan let the smoke curl from his lips. It did make sense. Just not the kind of sense men like Thorne and Vance understood. This wasn't about profit. Flour was for bellies, needles for clothes, morphine was for pain, and iron was for tools or maybe horseshoes. It was a list for survival, a list written by someone with a purpose. The mask, Ronan asked, wears a hammered piece of copper over his face. Vance said, like some damn heathen idol, no one's gotten a clear look at him. He's quick, too quick. Ronan needed the money. A lean winter had thinned his purse and his horse was due for a new set of shoes. But it was more than that. He hated standing still. The 4 walls of the office felt like a cage, the stale air thick and suffocating. His home was the horizon, his roof the endless sky. The road was the only place he felt whole. A puzzle like this, a trail to be unraveled, was a language he understood better than the clipped words of lawmen or the wheezing complaints of rich ranchers. Pay is $50 now, Thorne said, tapping a small, heavy pouch on the desk. 100 more when you bring him in, or bring back what's left of him. Vance leaned forward, his chair groaning in protest. We want him. Pike, not his ghost. We need to make an example. These attacks are making the other ranchers nervous. It's bad for business. Ronan looked at the pouch, then at the map Thorne slid next to it. The map was a crude drawing of canyons and ridges, an X marking the site of the attack. He took a final drag from his cigarette and dropped the butt to the floor, grinding it out with the worn heel of his boot. He picked up the pouch and the map. I ride alone, he said. It wasn't a request. Vance's thin lips tightened, but he nodded. He knew Pike's reputation. The man was a phantom, more comfortable in the Badlands than most men were in their own homes. He found things that didn't want to be found. An hour later, Ronan was miles out of town. The dusty streets of redemption a bad memory behind him. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the baked earth. He breathed in the clean, hot air. The scent of sage and distant rain a balm to his soul. His horse, a tough buckskin mare named Dust Devil, moved with a steady, ground-eating gait. He found the tracks where the map said they would be. The wagon ruts were deep, and the area was churned up from the ambush. He dismounted and knelt, his eyes scanning the ground, reading the story written in the dirt. He ignored the obvious signs. The mess left by Thorne's wagon driver. He was looking for something else, and he found it. Off to the side, sheltered by a scrubby juniper, was a single, perfect hoof print. He studied it for a long time. It was from an unshod horse, but that wasn't what held his attention. The hoof had been recently trimmed, the edges beveled with a skill that spoke of meticulous care. The frog was healthy, the wall thick. This wasn't the work of a common drifter who rode his horse into the ground. This was the mark of someone who depended on their mount for their very life. Someone who knew that a lame horse in this country was a death sentence. He had seen similar work before, among the Ute and the Shoshone, a kind of farriery that was more art than trade. He followed the faint trail away from the ambush site. The rider had kept to the rocky ground where possible, making the tracks faint and scattered. It was slow work. The sun crawled across the sky. Sweat soaked the collar of his shirt. He moved with a patient, practiced rhythm, his mind focused, his senses alive to every nuance of the landscape, the whisper of the wind through a rock formation, the alarm call of a distant hawk, the way the shadows stretched and shifted. Late in the afternoon, he spotted it. High on a ridge overlooking the trail, a patch of earth seemed wrong. The color was a shade off, the texture different from the surrounding ground. He tethered Dust Devil and began the climb, his boots finding silent purchase on the weathered rock. When he reached the spot, he saw what his instincts had told him. It was a shallow depression, just large enough for a man to lie prone, screened by a cluster of sagebrush, an old lookout post. He ran his fingers over the ground. It was still packed down from a body's weight. Whoever had waited here had been patient. He found no shell casings, no forgotten gear, just the impression of a body and a single, almost invisible sign. At the edge of the depression, tucked under a rock, was a tiny, shredded piece of fiber. He picked it up. It was yucca, carefully stripped and dried. Tinder, it was a common fire starter. But the way it was prepared, the specific shredding technique, was another piece of the puzzle. It was a habit, a signature of the people who had lived in these lands for 1,000 years. The thief was skilled with horses, the thief was patient, and the thief used the old ways. He followed the trail downward, losing it for an hour in a maze of granite boulders before finding it again in a sandy wash. Here, the tracks were clearer, but they showed another level of cunning. The rider had dismounted and used a branch to brush away his footprints. A classic technique to obscure a trail. It was done well, almost perfectly. This was no desperate farmer or disgruntled miner. This was someone who had been taught how to move without a trace. Someone trained in the art of disappearance. Ronan paused, chewing on a piece of dried beef. The picture was becoming clearer. A single rider, highly skilled, targeting specific goods necessary for survival, using native techniques to cover their tracks. He wasn't chasing a common outlaw. He was chasing a ghost with a purpose. Vance and Thorne wanted a simple villain, a man in a copper mask to hang from a gallows. But the story in the dirt was far more complicated. He chose not to follow the obvious path down the wash. The thief would expect that. Instead, Ronan looked up. A sheer wall of black basalt rose to his left, a forbidding cliff that seemed impassable. But halfway up, a narrow ledge, barely wide enough for a man, snaked its way along the rock face. It was a goat trail, a path few men would dare to take. It was dangerous, but it offered a vantage point. It was the last path anyone would expect him to choose. For 2 hours, he made his way along the basalt ridge. The wind threatened to pluck him from the rock and send him tumbling into the canyon below. He moved slowly, deliberately, his hands and feet finding holds in the rough, volcanic stone. He didn't think about the drop. He thought only of the next handhold, the next secure footing. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the western sky, he found what he was looking for. Tucked into a small alcove, hidden from view from the canyon floor below, was a discarded flour sack. It must have torn during the raid, spilling a portion of its contents, a small loss, not worth taking. He approached it cautiously. The sack was made of rough burlap, with the mill's logo faded on its side. A light dusting of white flour coated the ground around it. It seemed insignificant, a piece of trash left on the trail. But then he saw it. Pressed into the dusty white coating on the side of the sack was a handprint. It was small, perfectly formed. The lines of the palm, the shape of the fingers, they were unmistakably the print of a child. It was not a smear or a smudge. It was a clear, deliberate mark, as if a child had placed their hand flat against the sack before it was discarded. Ronan stared at the handprint for a long time. The setting sun cast a final, golden ray of light into the alcove, illuminating the small, dusty mark. In that moment, the job ceased to be about $50 and a pouch of gold. It was no longer a simple matter of a thief and a lawman. The lines of right and wrong, of justice and crime, which had always been so clear to him, now blurred into an indistinct haze. He had been hired to hunt a faceless villain, a shadow in a copper mask. But the story on the ground told of a skilled survivalist, someone from the native tribes, someone who stole not for greed but for need. And now, this small, silent testament in the dust, a child's hand. This wasn't about one person anymore. This was about a family, a people. This was about hunger. He stood up, his joints creaking. He looked out over the vast, darkening landscape. The pursuit had changed. He was still a tracker on a job, but a question had taken root in his mind. A question far more important than the location of the stolen goods. Who was this copper mask? And more importantly, who were they fighting so desperately to feed? He now understood that catching his quarry was only the beginning of the story. The sun was dying, bleeding out across the western sky in strokes of violent crimson and bruised purple. It set the high desert aglow, turning the rock formations into silhouettes of sleeping giants. Against this dramatic backdrop, a lone supply wagon, pulled by two weary mules, crawled along a dusty track. This was Ronan's bait. He had spent the better part of the day shadowing it from a distance, anticipating the move he knew was coming. It happened in an instant. A flicker of movement on the skyline, a shape detaching itself from the jagged rocks. The rider was a blur of motion, descending the scree slope with a reckless grace that was breathtaking. The sun caught the glint of metal on the rider's face, a featureless mask of hammered copper that turned the setting sun into a blinding flash. The attack was a masterpiece of efficiency. The masked rider didn't yell or brandish a weapon in a show of force. They simply rode parallel to the wagon, leaped from their saddle onto the lead mule's back, and with a single, sharp tug on the bridle, brought the entire outfit to a lurching, confused halt. The driver, a portly man with a face like a worried potato, could only gape in stunned silence. Before he could even think to reach for the shotgun by his feet, the rider had sliced the tethers on 2 sacks of grain, heaved them onto their horse's back, and was gone. The entire event took less than 20 seconds. It was less a robbery and more a phantom reaping. The figure melted back into the labyrinth of canyons as if swallowed by the earth itself. But Ronan hadn't been watching the wagon. He had been watching the land. He knew the paths, the game trails, the secret ways through this unforgiving country. He knew there was only one route that allowed for such a swift escape, while carrying that kind of weight, a narrow, treacherous cut through the sandstone cliffs known to a few old prospectors as Dagger Pass. It was barely a trail, a crack in the rock just wide enough for a single horse, with a sheer drop on one side, a perfect place for an ambush. He was already there, waiting. Dust Devil was hidden in a cluster of wind-stunted junipers, and Ronan himself was flattened against the rock wall just inside the entrance to the pass. The air in the narrow canyon was cool and still. the silence broken only by the faint whisper of the wind over the rimrock high above. He held his breath, becoming another shadow in the deepening twilight. Minutes later, he heard it, the soft, rhythmic clatter of a horse's hooves on stone, moving at a steady, unhurried pace. The rider was confident, believing themselves to be safe in the maze of rock. The sound grew closer, echoing slightly in the confined space. A horse appeared first, a lean pinto with intelligent eyes, its muscles working smoothly under its hide. Then came the rider. The copper mask was even more unsettling up close. It was a blank, impassive shield, reflecting the last vestiges of daylight in a dull, metallic sheen. The figure was smaller than Ronan had expected, wiry and compact, moving with the horse in a single, fluid motion. They were dressed in buckskin pants and a simple linen shirt, both stained with the dust of the trail. As the horse drew level with his position, Ronan moved. He didn't draw his pistol. A gunshot in this canyon would echo for miles, bringing unwanted attention. This had to be quiet. He lunged from the shadows, a silent explosion of movement. His target was the horse's reins. But the rider reacted with preternatural speed. They didn't startle or cry out. They simply moved, dropping low in the saddle and twisting their body away from him. Ronan's hand closed on empty air. In the same motion, the rider swung a leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground on the opposite side of the horse, using the animal as a shield. It was a move of incredible agility, more like a dancer than an outlaw. The horse, startled by the sudden appearance of a man, shied and backed away, leaving the two opponents facing each other in the narrow pass. The space was claustrophobic, the rock walls pressing in on either side. Sunlight was gone now, replaced by a deep, violet twilight that made it hard to read expressions, not that the mask had one to read. Steel rasped as the figure drew a knife. It wasn't a standard bowie or a skinning knife. The blade was long and curved, like a sharpened crescent moon, a weapon designed for slashing, quick and lethal. Ronan drew his own knife, a heavy, thick-spined bowie that had been his constant companion for a decade. The weight of it was familiar and reassuring in his palm. There were no words, no threats. The fight began. The masked figure lunged first, a low, swift thrust. The curved blade seemed to flow through the air, aimed for Ronan's ribs. Ronan parried, turning his heavier blade to catch the attack on its thick spine. Steel met steel with a sharp shing, and for a fraction of a second, a single, brilliant blue spark jumped between the two knives, a tiny star born and extinguished in the gloom. The force of the blow was surprising, a wiry strength that belied the attacker's slender frame. They moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. There were no wasted steps, no theatrical flourishes. Every feint was a test, every strike a potential end. Ronan was forced to give ground, the narrowness of the pass working against him, limiting his ability to use his longer reach. He parried another quick slash, the curved blade whistling past his ear. His opponent was fast, unbelievably fast, their footwork silent and precise on the rocky ground. They fought like a cornered wildcat, all fluid muscle and deadly intent. Ronan realized a defensive fight would be a losing one. He needed to change the rhythm, to break his opponent's flow. During the next exchange, instead of simply blocking, he let his left hand slide down his own blade, gripping it halfway down. When the curved knife came again, he caught it in the crook of his blade, twisted his wrist, and used the leverage to wrench his opponent off balance. For a heartbeat, the masked figure stumbled, their left foot sliding half a hand's breadth on a patch of loose gravel. It was the opening Ronan needed. He didn't press the attack with his knife. He lunged forward, closing the distance, and his free hand shot out. His fingers didn't go for the weapon or the throat. They tangled in the leather cord that held the copper mask in place. He clenched his fist and ripped it away. The mask came free with a soft tearing sound. It was a woman. The breath caught in Ronan's throat. He had been fighting a phantom, an idol, a thing of copper and shadow. Now he was facing a human being. Her hair was pulled back tightly from her face, but a few strands of raven black had come loose in the struggle, framing a face that was all sharp angles and defiant strength. Her skin was the color of the earth at sunset. There were no lines of fear or surprise on her features. And her eyes, they were the darkest eyes he had ever seen, deep and black as a desert well. They stared back at him, not with the fury of a defeated enemy, but with a strange, unnerving calm. It was as if she had been expecting this precise moment, as if his victory was merely a predetermined step in a much larger dance. The pause lasted only a second, but 1,000 unspoken things passed between them in that sliver of time. Then, her composure broke, but not into fear. It hardened into pure resolve. With a guttural cry, she surged forward, bringing her curved blade up in a vicious arc. Ronan, caught off guard by the revelation, was a fraction of a second too slow to react. He felt the cold, flat side of the blade press against the skin of his throat. He froze. The edge was sharp enough that the slightest pressure would open him up. Her body was pressed against his, and he could feel the tense, coiled strength within her. He could smell the scent of sage and sweat on her skin. Her dark eyes, inches from his own, held no malice, only a grim, sorrowful determination. She was going to do it. And then, a new sound intruded upon their deadly embrace. It came from the mouth of the pass, from the direction Ronan had come, the distinct, unmistakable sound of multiple horses, moving fast, the clatter of hooves, the jingle of harnesses, the low murmur of men's voices. A posse. It had to be Vance. The deputy must have been closer than he'd thought. The woman heard it too, her head tilted slightly, her eyes flicking past Ronan's shoulder toward the sound. The tension in her body changed. The killing intent seemed to drain away, replaced by a new, more urgent calculation. The hand holding the knife to his throat did not tremble. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered the blade. She took a step back, breaking the contact between them. The space she created felt like a chasm. She never took her eyes off him. The sound of the approaching riders grew louder, closer. They would be at the mouth of the pass in less than a minute. Ronan stood perfectly still, his mind racing to catch up with the sudden, violent shifts in the situation. One moment he was the hunter, the next the hunted, then the victor, and now he was something else entirely. A witness, a complication. The woman gave a sharp, almost imperceptible shake of her head, as if clearing it of a thought. She looked at him, then at the approaching danger, then back at him. Her gaze was intense, analytical. She was weighing him, judging him. She didn't speak. She simply lifted her chin, a small, sharp gesture toward the dark, twisting canyon that lay behind her, a path into the unknown. Her eyes delivered the message, a silent, stark choice offered in the face of oncoming death. Follow me if you want to live. There was no time for questions. There was only the thunder of approaching hooves and the woman's sharp, urgent gesture. Ronan didn't hesitate. To stay was to be captured or worse by Vance's posse. To follow a woman who had just held a blade to his throat was a gamble. But it was the only gamble on the table. He followed. She moved with the certainty of a mountain goat, her pinto horse forgotten as she scrambled up a steep rock fall. She didn't look back to see if he was behind her. She simply assumed he would be. Ronan, his lungs burning, pushed himself harder, his worn boots slipping on the loose shale. At the top of the scree, hidden behind a curtain of ancient, gnarled juniper, was a crack in the cliff face. It was no more than a dark slit, a scar in the rock barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. A cold, dead air, smelling of damp stone and something ancient and untouched, breathed out from the opening. "In here," she whispered, the first word he had heard her speak. Her voice was low and steady, without a trace of the frantic energy of their flight. She slipped through the opening and was gone. For a moment, Ronan stood alone in the twilight, the sounds of the posse echoing from the pass below. They were shouting now, their voices angry and confused. He could hear Vance's distinctive, grating tone barking orders. He took one last look at the open sky and then plunged into the blackness. the world vanished. The immediate drop in temperature was a shock, the cold of the deep earth seeping into his bones. The darkness was absolute, a thick, palpable void that swallowed all light and dimension. He was blind. The only thing real was the rough wall of the passage against his hands and the sound of the woman's soft footsteps ahead. "Stay low," her voice came, disembodied in the dark, "and keep a hand on the left wall." He did as he was told, shuffling forward, his senses screaming in the sensory deprivation. The passage quickly narrowed and the ceiling dropped. Soon he was forced into a crouch, and then onto his hands and knees. The floor was not smooth. It was ridged and sharp, the texture of cooled lava, volcanic rock, abrasive as a rasp, scraped at his palms and the knees of his canvas trousers. He could feel the ceiling now, grazing his shoulders and back. It was a coffin of stone, and they were crawling deeper into its belly. The tension was a physical thing, a knot tightening in his gut. Every instinct, honed by years of living under an open sky, rebelled against this confinement. His world had shrunk to the space his own body occupied, the scrape of his own clothes, and the harsh sound of his own breathing, loud and ragged in the suffocating silence. Then, sounds from the outside world filtered through the rock, muffled and distorted, muffled shouts. The angry bark of a rifle, fired in frustration. And then a sound that made the hair on Ronan's arms stand up, the faint, metallic clink of an ejected shell casing hitting stone. They were right outside the entrance, searching. Vance was not a man to give up easily. The sounds were a spur, driving them deeper into the earth. The passage became a tunnel, forcing them flat onto their bellies. Now the journey was a torment. Ronan had to turn his head sideways, his cheek pressed against the cold. Gritty floor, the ceiling was a constant, oppressive weight just inches above his back, scraping him raw with every forward motion. He could feel his shirt bunching up, the sharp rock biting directly into his skin. His shoulders burned. He moved like a snake, a slow, agonizing wriggle into utter blackness. The only proof that he was not alone was the faint scraping sound of the woman moving ahead of him. She made almost no noise, her progress a soft, slithering whisper. He had no idea how long they crawled. Time lost all meaning in the dark. It could have been minutes or an hour. The only reality was the next painful push forward, the burning in his muscles, and the ever-present, crushing weight of the mountain above. Suddenly, the scraping ahead of him stopped. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What is it?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "The Narrows," she replied, her voice seeming to come from just a few feet away. "The stone waste. Go slow. You are broader than I am." He reached the spot and understood. The already tight passage constricted even further, a natural bottleneck where the volcanic tube had cooled unevenly. It looked impassable, a space meant for lizards, not men. He took a breath and pushed himself forward, trying to make himself as thin as possible. He was wrong. It was impassable. His shoulders, broad from years of roping and riding, wedged tight. He was stuck. A primal wave of panic, cold and sickening, washed over him. He was trapped, entombed alive in the heart of the mountain. He tried to push forward, but the rock held him fast. He tried to back up, but the angle was wrong. His clothes and gear catching on the unforgiving stone. The air in his lungs felt thick and unbreathable. The darkness, which had been a simple absence of light, now felt like a physical entity, pressing in on him, suffocating him. He felt a movement in the darkness ahead. The woman was coming back. He heard a soft rustle and then felt a touch, a hand, firm and steady, pressed flat against his sternum. The contact was a shock, a spark of human warmth in the cold. Dead stone. It was not a gentle touch. It was practical, confident. She said nothing. She simply pressed once, then twice, a clear, rhythmic pressure against his chest. "Breathe out." The message was as clear as if she had shouted it. Ronan forced the panic down. He trusted the silent command. He emptied his lungs, his chest deflating. The pressure on his shoulders eased by a fraction of an inch, with her hand still on his chest, guiding him. She began to pull on the collar of his shirt. He pushed with his toes, and with an excruciating scrape of bone and cloth against rock, he slid forward. An inch, then another. Then he was through, gasping for breath on the other side, his body trembling with adrenaline and relief. He lay there for a moment, the rough floor a comfort beneath him. She had already moved on. He had put his life, his very breath, in the hands of his enemy, and she had saved him. They continued their crawl, the passage mercifully widening slightly. After a few more yards, he sensed a change in the air, a slight draft, carrying a different scent, not of stale rock but of cool night air and something green. A faint light appeared ahead, a pale, ghostly luminescence. They were crawling toward it, two weary insects drawn to a distant moon. The tunnel ended abruptly. It didn't open out onto a mountainside, but into a vertical shaft. They had emerged onto a ledge inside a massive, natural well, a perpendicular lava tube that went straight up. Ronan looked up, and his breath caught in his throat. Above them was a perfect circle of the night sky. It was a swatch of deep violet velvet, so dark and clear that the Milky Way was a thick, shimmering river of light. The stars were not faint specks. They were brilliant, blazing points of fire, like scattered diamond dust on a blanket. After the absolute black of the tunnel, the sight was so beautiful it was painful. The woman was already on her feet, standing on the wide ledge. She was looking not at the stars, but at the lip of the shaft high above. Ronan pulled himself up beside her. Now that his eyes had adjusted, he could see the walls of the shaft were not smooth, but pocked with handholds and footholds. It was a natural ladder, and on the edge of their ledge, carved into the stone, were marks. They were not random scratches from geology. They were deliberate, geometric carvings, worn smooth by the passage of countless hands over countless years. An arrow pointing up, a symbol like a coiled serpent. It was a map, a guide. This was an ancestral escape route, a secret passed down through generations. He was a trespasser in a place far older than any land deed or government map. As they stood there, a new sound drifted down from the rim of the shaft, a low, breathy whistle, the sound a night bird might make. It was answered a moment later by another, from a different direction. The woman's body, which had been tense, relaxed slightly. Her allies, they were out there, forming a perimeter, watching the watchers. The hunters had become the hunted. She turned her back to the sky and began her preparations. She swiftly unbraided and retied her long black hair, pulling it back so tightly it seemed to sharpen the angles of her face. She checked the lacing of her moccasins, pulling the leather thongs taut. There was no wasted motion. She was all purpose, a warrior preparing for the next stage of a long war. She hadn't given him her name. She hadn't asked for his. They were two strangers, defined only by their present, shared circumstance. For the first time since their violent encounter, Ronan spoke a question of his own. His voice was a low rasp. Why, he asked. The flour, the iron. What do you take from them for? She finished tying her moccasin and rose to her full height. She turned to face him, her features cast in the faint, silvery starlight that filtered down the shaft. Her dark eyes were impossible to read, holding the same depth and mystery as the night sky above. To pay a debt, she said, her voice even and clear. A debt of hunger. She turned and began to climb, her hands and feet finding the ancient holds with practiced ease. Ronan watched her for a moment, the 5 simple words hanging in the cool night air. A debt of hunger. The phrase was a stone dropped into a deep well, its ripples spreading out in ever-widening circles of meaning. He looked down into the blackness of the tunnel they had escaped, then up at the woman ascending toward the stars. He took a breath of the clean, free air and began to climb. Their footsteps, scraping softly on the volcanic rock, fell into a shared rhythm. 2 adversaries, 2 strangers, bound by a shared enemy and a shared breath, moving as one into the vast, waiting darkness. But the question remained, a silent echo in the shaft. Whose hunger was so great, and what community was she willing to kill and die to feed? They emerged from the top of the shaft into a world of silver and black. The moon had not yet risen, but the sheer number of stars cast a faint, ethereal light over the high country, enough to see the shapes of rocks and the skeletal forms of ancient, wind-scoured pines. The air was thin and bitingly cold, a clean, sharp cold that felt as if it could strip a man's soul bare. They were in a small, hidden bowl of a valley, a pocket of stillness cupped in the hands of the mountains. A narrow stream, fed by some hidden spring, gurgled over a bed of smooth, dark stones, its voice the only sound in the immense silence. The woman led him to the water's edge. She knelt, cupped her hands, and drank deeply. Ronan followed suit, the icy water a shock to his system, washing away the dust and claustrophobia of the tunnel. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. He splashed the water on his face, feeling the sting where the rock had scraped his back and the raw, throbbing line on his cheekbone. She noticed him wince. Without a word, she rose and disappeared into the shadows of the pines. Ronan remained by the stream, every muscle in his body aching with a deep, profound weariness. He was a tracker, a hunter. He was supposed to be the one in control, the one who knew the land. But in the last hour, he had been disarmed, nearly killed, led blindly through the earth, and saved from his own panic by the very person he had been hired to capture. The world had turned upside down. He looked at his hands in the starlight. They were scraped and raw. He felt like a stranger in his own skin. She returned as silently as she had left. In her hand was a cluster of leaves and feathery white flowers. Yarrow. He recognized the plant. She knelt again by the water, using a smooth, flat stone as a mortar and a smaller, rounded one as a pestle. She crushed the leaves and flowers into a dark green pulp, the faint, medicinal scent rising into the cold air. She came to him. He was sitting on a flat rock, and she knelt in front of him. She did not ask permission. She simply reached out, her fingers surprisingly gentle, and tilted his chin up toward the starlight. For a moment, he tensed, the instinct to recoil from his captor warring with a strange, weary stillness. He did not pull away. Her fingers were cool and calloused, the touch practical and sure. She applied the pulped yarrow to the cut on his cheek. It stung, a sharp, clean pain, but it was followed by a spreading coolness that soothed the angry throb. She worked in complete silence, her focus absolute. Her face was close to his, and in the faint starlight, he could see the fine, fierce lines of her features, the unwavering intensity in her dark eyes. This was the same woman who had held a blade to his throat. The memory was so fresh it was almost a physical presence between them. Yet here she was, tending to his wound as if he were one of her own. When she was finished, she wiped her fingers on a handful of dry moss. She remained kneeling before him for a moment, the silence stretching between them, filled with the soft rush of the stream. "My name is Tala," she said. Her voice was as clear and cold as the water. Ronan just nodded, his throat tight. "I am the daughter of Neosi, the chief of this band," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "The people the ranchers call the Uplanders, because that is where they have pushed us. To the high rocks, where nothing grows." She rose and walked to the edge of the small valley. She pointed south toward a distant, monolithic ridge that cut a jagged line against the star-dusted sky. "You see that ridge?" she asked. "That is the line, everything from there, down to the Green River Valley. That was my father's land, his father's land before him. Now, it is Jedediah Thorne's summer pasture. He marks it with white posts and sharp wire. The names fell into the quiet between them. Jedediah Thorne, the man who had hired him, the man with the soft hands and the wheezing breath." Ronan felt a sour taste in his mouth. He looked at the distant ridge and the pieces of his world, the simple, clear lines of a job, a paycheck, and a trail to follow, began to crack and shift. A memory surfaced, unbidden. It was from 2 years ago, a job he'd taken down in the Red River country. A cattle baron had paid him well to clear a small band of natives from a spring-fed canyon. The man had called them squatters. Ronan had just called it a job. He hadn't used violence. He hadn't needed to. He had just made his presence known, a constant, silent threat on the canyon rim. He'd made them nervous, made them feel watched. After a week, they had packed their meager belongings and moved on, disappearing into the desert. He had collected his money and ridden away, never giving them a second thought. Until now. The confession came out before he could stop it, the words rough and unpolished. "I was hired once to move a family off a waterhole, so a man could graze his cattle there." He expected anger, contempt, another flash of the warrior who had fought him in the pass. But Tala's expression didn't change. She simply nodded, as if he were confirming a fact she had known her entire life. "The water is the first thing they take," she said. It was a statement of ancient truth, simple and devastating. Then the grass, then the trees, then the land itself. She turned back to him, her eyes holding his in the starlight. "We do not take lives, Ronan Pike. That is not our way. We take what we need to survive. Flour for bread, medicine for the sick, iron to shoe our horses. We take only what they first took from us. We defend ourselves when we must. Nothing more." Her words laid out her code, a law of survival born from injustice. It was a kind of justice he had never considered, a justice without a badge or a courthouse. As she finished speaking, a sound cut through the night, sharp, unnatural, the distinct crack of a dry branch snapping under a heavy boot. It came from the direction of the lava tube. Instantly, they both froze, becoming as still as the rocks around them. They were statues in the starlight, listening. The sound was not repeated, but it didn't need to be. The message was clear. The posse had not given up. They had found the entrance to the tunnel, and they had made it through. Ronan's blood ran cold. He had thought the passage was their salvation, a secret way that would leave their pursuers stumped. But he had underestimated them. Or, more likely, he had underestimated their guide. Vance was a town lawman. He would be lost in these mountains. Someone else was with them, someone who knew the old paths. Tala's brief moment of stillness was over. She was already in motion, her mind working, calculating. "They know this valley," she whispered, her voice tight. "They will have the stream watched. We cannot go down." "Then we go up," Ronan said, his own instincts taking over. She nodded, her eyes already scanning the towering cliffs that formed the northern wall of the valley. "There is a way. The Night North Pass. It is a path for spirits and desperate men. No one takes it after dark, no one but us. It was a decision born of pure necessity, a path so dangerous that it was their only hope." She moved to her meager supplies, a small leather pouch she had carried with her. She took out a small, flat stone, no bigger than her palm. She pressed it into his hand. "Keep this," she said, "so your spirit does not get lost on the high trail." Ronan looked down. The stone was smooth and cool, a piece of dark river rock. Carved into its surface was the lean, powerful form of a wolf, its head thrown back as if howling at the moon. The carving was old, the lines worn smooth from years of being held. His fingers closed around the stone, and as he took it from her, their hands touched. It was a brief, fleeting contact, skin against skin. But in that instant, something profound shifted inside him. It was a jolt, more powerful than any blow. The last remnants of his simple, black and white world of client and target, law and outlaw, right and wrong crumbled into dust. He was no longer Ronan Pike, the tracker, on a job for Jedediah Thorne. He was just a man, standing in the starlight beside a woman named Tala, holding a piece of her history in his hand, with their shared enemies closing in. He looked up from the stone and met her gaze. He saw the warrior. He saw the chief's daughter. But for the first time, he also saw the weight of her purpose, the crushing burden of her people's survival that she carried with such fierce grace. He slid the wolf stone into his pocket. It felt warm against his leg. "Who's with them?" he asked, his voice low. "Who's leading Vance through this country?" At night, Tala was already moving toward the base of the northern cliff, her form a gliding shadow. "A man who is not afraid of the dark," she said, not looking back, "because he believes he has already bought the souls of all the spirits that live in it." The path was not a path. It was a lie the mountain told. a suggestion of a ledge where no ledge should exist. The night north pass was a black thread stitched onto a vertical tapestry of stone, and below it lay nothing, a silent, bottomless abyss of air and shadow. The world had been reduced to three elements: the rough, cold granite under Ronan's fingers, the vast emptiness to his right, and the dark, focused silhouette of Tala moving ahead of him. She moved in a way he had never seen before. It wasn't walking. It was a form of silent, rhythmic meditation. She didn't rely on sight in the suffocating darkness. She relied on breath. She would take 3 short, quiet breaths as she took 3 steps, her feet finding purchase with an uncanny certainty. Then she would pause, exhale slowly, and listen to the wind, to the rock, to the night itself before beginning the sequence again. It was a cadence of survival, a way of measuring the unmeasurable, of imposing a human rhythm on the mountain's chaotic indifference. Ronan, a man who could track a single horse across 100 miles of hard-pan desert, felt like a newborn foal. His instincts were useless here. The skills that had kept him alive his entire life, reading the ground, watching the horizon, listening for the snap of a twig, were nullified. Here, looking down meant vertigo and a fatal fall. Looking ahead meant staring into a blackness that his eyes could not penetrate. He had no choice but to learn her way. He started to time his own breathing to hers, to match his clumsy, booted steps to the soft, sure placement of her moccasins. Inhale, step, inhale, step, inhale, step, exhale, pause. The rhythm was a lifeline, the only thing keeping his mind from the terrifying reality of his position. The wind was a living thing, a malevolent spirit that prowled the pass. It would die down to a whisper and then, without warning, slam into them with a physical force, trying to peel them from the rock face. During one such gust, Ronan's focus wavered for a fraction of a second. His foot, searching for its next hold, found only empty air. His balance was gone. The world tilted, a sickening lurch as his body was pulled toward the abyss. He scraped against the rock wall, his fingers scrabbling for purchase, his mind a white flash of pure, cold terror. Before he could even cry out, a hand shot back and clamped onto his forearm like a vice. It was Tala. She hadn't even turned her head. She had felt his misstep, his shift in weight, as if they were connected by an invisible thread. Her grip was iron, anchoring him to the mountain. She didn't speak. She just held him, her own body braced, until the gust passed and he had found his footing again. She released him, and after a single, shared breath in the roaring silence, she moved on. He stood trembling, his heart a wild drum against his ribs. She had saved his life. The debt was absolute, a weight that settled deep in his soul. He owed her his breath. He focused, pushing the fear down, and fell back into the rhythm, his concentration now honed to a razor's edge. They continued for what felt like an eternity. The mountain was a relentless test of endurance. His muscles screamed, and the cold had seeped deep into his bones. They rounded a sharp buttress of rock, the path narrowing to a treacherous slick of loose scree. His foot slipped again, this time on a patch of loose gravel. He went down on one knee, his momentum carrying him toward the edge. Once again, her hand was there, grabbing the front of his shirt and hauling him back from the brink with a strength that seemed impossible for her size. He was left gasping, the stone wolf in his pocket digging into his thigh, a debt of life, paid a second time. It was a currency that bound him to her more tightly than any rope or chain. They had been climbing for hours when a new element appeared in the darkness, a light. It was a single point of orange, far above them, moving slowly but steadily down the pass toward them. It was not the bright, nervous lantern of a lawman. It was a torch, its flame guttering and dancing in the wind. A posse would have used multiple lanterns, would have been making noise. This was something else. Tala stopped. She gave a low, soft whistle, the same bird call they had heard from the lava tube. A moment later, an identical whistle answered from above. She relaxed, turning to Ronan. "It is one of us," she whispered. The torch drew closer, revealing the figure who carried it. It was a woman, but where Tala was lean and fierce, This woman was carved from the mountain itself. She was older, her face a mask of deep-set wrinkles, each line a story of hardship and survival. Her hair was a thick braid of silver and black, and her eyes, even in the flickering torchlight, were sharp and missed nothing. She moved with the same sure-footed grace as Tala, her moccasins making no sound. She stopped a few feet from them, planting the butt of the torch staff on the path. The flame illuminated the three of them in a small, precarious circle of light. "Atsidi," Tala said, her voice filled with a warmth Ronan had not heard before. "Aunt." Atsidi's gaze swept over Tala and then settled on Ronan. It was not a friendly look. It was an assessment, sharp and thorough, like a rancher judging horseflesh. She looked at his clothes, his face, the way he stood. She saw everything. "You bring a stranger to the high places," Atsidi said, her voice a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. It was not a question. "He was hunted by the same men who hunt us." Tala replied simply, "His enemy is our enemy." Atsidi grunted, a sound of skepticism. "An enemy can wear many faces. Vance has a new tracker, one who knows our hills." She looked pointedly at Ronan. "It is not him," Tala said, her tone final. Atsidi accepted it. For now. She turned her attention back to the reason she had come. "The news is bad. Vance is not a fool. He has men at the sunken spring and at the mouth of the Two Crows Canyon. He has blocked the easy ways down. He is stretching a net across the mountains." Ronan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Vance was smarter than he'd given him credit for. By controlling the water and the main passes, he could simply wait. He was strangling them, cutting them off from escape. "Then we will not take the easy way," Tala said. Atsidi's wrinkled face broke into a grim smile. "There is another way, the path the spring floods take. It is a steep road to the underworld, but it will lead you below his net." She turned and began to lead the way down, not back the way they had come, but off the main ledge and onto an even more perilous-looking track. This was no longer a path. It was a controlled fall. They descended a narrow, twisting gully, a deep scar gouged into the mountainside by centuries of violent, seasonal floods. The ground was a treacherous mix of slick, moss-covered rock and loose, shifting gravel. It was a place where a single misstep would send a man tumbling to his death. Getting the horses down was a nightmare. They had retrieved their mounts, Tala's pinto and Ronan's buckskin, Dust Devil from a hidden corral where Tala had left them. Now, they were forced to lead the animals down the impossibly steep channel. The horses, terrified, their eyes wide in the torchlight, dug their hooves in, fighting for purchase. More than once, a horseshoe slipped on the damp stone, sending a shower of bright orange sparks into the darkness and the sickening sound of sliding hooves. Both Ronan and Tala had to throw their full weight against the animals to keep them from tumbling into the abyss. Atsidi, wiry and tireless, seemed to float down the gully, the torch held high, pointing out handholds and footholds they never would have seen. After another hour of the brutal, leg-trembling descent, the gully floor began to level out. The air grew warmer, and the sheer rock walls gave way to sloping hills dotted with pinon pine and juniper. They had made it. They had come down from the high pass and were now in a deep, hidden valley that was shielded from the outside world by a ring of impassable cliffs. The floor of the valley was covered in a fine, reddish-black dust, and the air carried a faint, metallic tang. In the center of the valley, the skeletal remains of an old mining operation, a head frame. A collapsed tipple stood like the bones of some long-dead beast. It was an abandoned copper mine, and all around it, nestled among the rocks and pines, were the quiet signs of life, the soft glow of shielded fires, the low nicker of horses, the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat. This was it, the hidden camp, the home of the uplanders. They stopped at the edge of the settlement. Atsidi drove the butt of her torch into the soft, cinder-like earth. The journey was over. But for Ronan, the real trial was just beginning. Atsidi turned to him, her face lit from below by the flickering flame. Her expression was hard to read, a mixture of suspicion and something else. something that might have been a grudging respect for the fact that he was still standing. "Tala vouches for you," the old woman said, her voice low. "That carries the weight of a chief's word in this place, but a word is wind. It is your actions that will be weighed." She paused, her sharp eyes boring into his. "Trust the right person, son, but do not trust unconditionally. Even the strongest rope has a fraying strand." The warning hung in the air, cryptic and heavy with unspoken meaning. Before Ronan could ask what she meant, Tala gestured for him to follow. He had arrived. He had survived the pass. He was in the heart of their sanctuary. But Atsidi's words echoed in his mind. He was a white man in a native camp, a tracker brought in by the chief's daughter. He was an anomaly, a threat, a potential ally. He was 100 different things to the people who watched him now from the shadows. And he knew, with a cold certainty, that the council would be waiting. The settlement was not a village in the way Ronan understood the word. There were no straight lines, no saloon, no general store. It was a living thing, woven into the fabric of the valley. Hide lodges and wickiups, their shapes organic and low to the ground, were nestled in the protective embrace of the pines and the dark, copper-stained cliffs. The air was a mix of sharp pine resin and the comforting, savory scent of cook smoke. He saw strips of jerky drying on racks, tanned hides stretched on wooden frames, and heard the soft, rhythmic scrape of a tool against leather. Horses, the lifeblood of any people in this vast country, stood quietly tethered, their warm breath pluming in the cold night air. This was not a temporary camp. It was a home, a sanctuary built in the shadow of a world that wanted it erased. But it was a home on high alert. As they walked into the central clearing, figures emerged from the shadows. They were not smiling. Their faces were hard. Their eyes narrowed with suspicion as they looked upon the white man Tala had brought into their midst. Every man he saw was armed, and they moved with the quiet, predatory grace of hunters. One warrior, broader and taller than the rest, stepped forward to block their path. His hair was cut short except for a single, long scalp lock, and his face was a mask of grim resolve. He carried himself with the heavy authority of a man responsible for the lives of others. His gaze flicked from Tala to Ronan, and what little warmth might have been there for the chief's daughter was extinguished when it landed on the stranger. "Dakota," Tala said, her voice even. "He is with me." Dakota's eyes did not leave Ronan's. "He carries their steel." He nodded toward the Colt peacemaker holstered on Ronan's hip and the Bowie knife sheathed at his belt. It was not a request. Ronan understood. He was in their home, under their laws. To resist would be an act of aggression, a confirmation of their worst fears. Slowly, deliberately, he unbuckled his gun belt and handed it, holster and all, to Dakota. The warrior took it, his eyes never blinking. Ronan then drew the heavy Bowie knife from its sheath and offered it hilt first. Dakota accepted it as well. Ronan was now unarmed, vulnerable, his life entirely in their hands. Dakota gave a curt nod, a flicker of something that might have been reluctant respect in his eyes, before melting back into the shadows, taking Ronan's weapons with him. Tala led him to the center of the camp, where a large, well-tended fire burned, its flames a defiant heart against the cold and the dark. Seated on logs in a semicircle facing the fire were 5 men. They were the elders, the council. Their faces were landscapes of time, etched with the lines of worry, wisdom, and sorrow. They wore simple buckskin and wool blankets, their only adornments a few beads or a single feather. In the center of the half-circle, on a low stool draped with a buffalo hide, sat a man whose stillness was more powerful than any movement. His hair was more silver than black, and his face, though deeply lined, held a calm, immense dignity. This was Chief Neosi. He did not look at Ronan as he approached. He stared into the fire, as if reading the future in its dancing flames. Tala stopped before her father and bowed her head slightly. "Father," she said. Neosi finally lifted his gaze. He looked at his daughter, his expression unreadable, and then his eyes settled on Ronan. They were dark, Intelligent eyes that had seen more winters than Ronan could imagine. They held no malice, only an ancient, soul-weary weight. He did not seem to be looking at a man, but at a symbol, a question that had haunted his people for generations. He gestured with one hand to the empty space before the fire. Ronan stepped forward, feeling the heat on his shins and the intense scrutiny of the 6 men before him. The rest of the camp had gathered behind him, a silent, watchful circle. He was on an island, the fire in front, the tribe behind, and judgment all around. For a long time, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind in the tall pines. Neosi was in no hurry. He let the silence work, let it strip away any pretense or falsehood. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried a profound authority that cut through the night. My daughter has risked her life, and the secret of this place. For you, the chief began, his words slow and deliberate. He looked from Ronan to Tala, and then back again. She fought you, then she saved you. She tells the council that your enemy is our enemy. He paused, his gaze pinning Ronan in place. The question the elders ask is simple. Why? Why would a white man, a tracker paid by the cattle kings who steal our land, stand with the daughter of a people he was sent to hunt? The question was the crux of everything. Ronan could have lied. He could have invented a story of a sudden change of heart, a moral awakening. But he knew, looking into the chief's unflinching eyes, that a lie, no matter how well crafted, would be a fatal poison. They had not survived this long by being fools. He thought of the child's handprint on the flour sack. He thought of Tala's words, a debt of hunger. He thought of the 2 times she had pulled him back from the abyss on the night North Pass. He met Neosi's gaze directly. I was hired to track a thief, Ronan said, his voice a low, rough thing. But the trail told a different story. It wasn't a story of greed. It was a story of survival. He took a breath, the words coming out plain and unadorned. I don't know much about justice, Chief, but I know what hunger looks like. I chose to stand with the hungry. A murmur went through the crowd behind him. The elders exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Tala stood perfectly still, her face a mask. Neosi continued to stare at Ronan, his gaze seeming to probe for the slightest hint of deception. Before the chief could speak, a new voice cut in, sharp and angry. It was a young warrior from the crowd, his face painted with 2 black stripes of mourning or war. Ronan couldn't tell which. It might have been both. He speaks with a clever tongue, the young man spat. Stepping forward, he pointed a finger at Ronan. He is a snake. He tracks for Vance. He led them through the lava tube. How do we know this is not a trick? A way to learn our strengths, to find our weaknesses, before he leads the soldiers here to finish what they started? He turned to Neosi, his voice filled with a desperate passion. To trust this man is to tear the roof from your lodge in the middle of a blizzard. He is not our kind. Another young warrior voiced his agreement, and then another. The dissent was a fire of its own, spreading quickly among the younger generation, the ones who had known nothing but loss and retreat. They were the ones with the freshest scars. Neosi raised a hand. The dissent died instantly, smothered by the weight of his authority. He had allowed the anger to be voiced, to be heard, but he would not let it rule. He turned his gaze from the angry young men back to Ronan. Words are wind, as my sister at Sidi says. Neosi said, his voice calm and steady. They can be true, or they can be a storm that hides a lie. A man is known by his actions. Trust is not a gift we can afford to give. It must be earned, forged, like the iron you sought to recover. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees. You wish to stand with the hungry, then you will help us feed them. Deputy Vance is still in the mountains. He is a dog with a fresh scent, and he will not give up. He believes you are with us now, a captive or a traitor. This makes you the perfect bait. Neosi's plan was simple, brutal, and brilliant. You will take the fastest horse. You will lead Vance and his men on a chase, away from this valley, away from our winter camps. You will pull his net in the wrong direction for 2 days. Give us time to move supplies, to prepare. If you do this, you will have bought your life, and perhaps a measure of our trust. If you fail, or if you betray us, Vance will not be your greatest fear. The choice was clear. It was not a choice at all. It was a sentence and a chance. I'll do it, Ronan said without hesitation. He will not go alone. Tala's voice cut in, sharp and clear. She stepped forward, standing beside Ronan. He does not know the false trails, the dead-end canyons. He does not know how Vance thinks. I will go with him. I will guide him. One of the elders shook his head. It is too great a risk. Daughter of Neosi, to send you back out into the jaws of the wolf. It is a greater risk to send him alone, Tala countered, her dark eyes flashing. He is our best chance to lead them astray. But I am the only one who can guarantee he does not get cornered. I will not be a captive. I know how to disappear. Neosi listened, his gaze moving between his daughter's fierce, determined face and Ronan's stoic acceptance. He saw the bond that had been forged between them in fire and darkness. He saw a risk, but he also saw an opportunity. 2 days, the chief said, his voice leaving no room for argument. You will guide him for 2 days. At the dawn of the 3rd day, you will turn back and return to this camp. He will continue on his own. That is the judgment of this council. Tala nodded, accepting the terms. Neosi then gave a signal to Dakota, who had been watching from the edge of the clearing. The warrior disappeared for a moment and returned, not with Ronan's weapons, but with something else. He held it out, and the firelight glinted on its metallic surface. It was the copper mask. Neosi took it from Dakota. Vance and Thorn are hunting a ghost in a copper mask, the chief said, his voice low. It is time they saw their ghost again. He held the mask out to Ronan. They will see this from a mile away. They will follow it like moths to a flame. Let them chase a symbol, while we do the real work of survival. Ronan took the mask. It was heavier than he expected, the copper cool against his skin. He ran a thumb over its smooth, featureless surface. It was an identity, a weapon, and a target all in one. He was being asked to become the very phantom he had been sent to hunt. He looked at Tala, and she gave him a single, sharp nod. They were in this together, for 2 days at least. He slung the leather cord of the mask over the saddle horn of the fresh horse they brought him. It hung there, catching the firelight, a silent, blatant invitation. The plan felt sound. It was clever. It was daring. But as Ronan mounted the horse, he felt the weight of Atsidi's warning settle over him again. Trust the right person, but do not trust unconditionally. The plan accounted for Vance, and it accounted for the tribe's need for time. But a chill crept up his spine, a tracker's instinct that warned him of an unseen variable, a predator that was not in the firelight of the council, nor in the posse chasing them. They were preparing to play a dangerous game of deception, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were not the only players on the board. Dawn broke cold and sharp, a blade of pale light on the eastern horizon. There was no warmth in it. They stood on a high, sandy slope, the wind a constant, abrasive whisper. Below them, the Badlands were a labyrinth of shadow and stone. This was the stage. Ronan watched as Tala expertly guided her pinto across the face of the dune. She wasn't trying to hide her trail. She was creating it, a blatant, undeniable line in the sand. She rode in a wide, sweeping zigzag, a pattern that would be visible for miles to anyone with a spyglass. Ronan followed, his horse's hooves sinking into the soft, yielding earth, deepening the impression. He had spent his life learning to move like a ghost, to leave no trace. Now, he was being asked to shout his presence to the world, at his saddle horn. The copper mask was a dull, winking eye, catching the first rays of the sun. It was the centerpiece of their deception. By mid-morning, the hunt was on. They heard it before they saw it, the faint, popping echo of a rifle shot, a sound swallowed and distorted by the vastness of the canyons. It was a signal. Vance had found their trail. He was on them. From then on, the pursuit was a constant, gnawing presence at their backs. They were tied to the posse by an invisible rope of dust and sound. They would ride hard for an hour. pushing their horses through treacherous arroyos and up steep, rocky inclines, only to pause on a high ridge and see the telltale plume of dust rising in the distance, a dirty finger pointing them out to the heavens. It never got closer, but it never fell away. It was a relentless, grinding pressure. Tala was a master of this deadly game. She never chose the fastest route. She chose the most visible one. She led them along the spines of barren, sun-blasted ridgelines, keeping them silhouetted against the sky. It was a calculated risk, a piece of breathtaking arrogance. She was showing Vance his quarry, keeping the bait just in front of his nose, but always across a canyon or up a cliff face that was impossible to charge. She was controlling the distance, playing with him, turning the vast, open country into a cage of her own design. Ronan could only admire her skill. She read the land not as a map of points, but as a series of interconnected possibilities. She knew which slopes would hold a track, which rockfalls would slow a large group of men, which narrow passes would force them into a single, vulnerable file. She was not just fleeing, she was conducting a symphony of misdirection. The sun was a merciless hammer in a brass-colored sky. Sweat and dust caked their faces into gritty masks. The only sounds were the creak of saddle leather, the heavy breathing of their horses, and the ceaseless whine of the wind. They spoke little, saving their breath and their energy. They were two parts of a single, desperate machine, moving in perfect, silent unison. Late in the afternoon, as the shadows began to stretch and bleed across the canyon floors, Tala led him to a place of refuge. It was a shallow cave, a hollowed-out space under a massive overhang of sandstone, its mouth screened by a thicket of hardy, desert-stunted oak. It was barely a shelter, a cramped pocket of rock, but it was hidden from the sky and offered a commanding view of the trail below. They dismounted, their bodies screaming with the ache of a full day spent in the saddle. The horses lathered in sweat, their flanks heaving, drank greedily from the water Ronan poured into his hat from a water skin. They were reaching their limit. Inside the alcove, the air was still and cool. The oppressive heat of the day fell away, leaving a sudden, profound silence. The relentless pressure of the chase eased for the first time. It was as if the world had taken a breath. They sat on the sandy floor, their backs against the rough stone wall, sharing a strip of dried meat and a mouthful of water. They were so close their shoulders almost touched, two exhausted figures in a small, shared space. The silence, which had been a necessity during the ride, now became something else. It was a space to be filled. "You're good at this," Ronan said, his voice a hoarse crackle. "Better than anyone I've ever seen." Tala was staring out at the vast, empty landscape, her dark eyes tracking a hawk circling on a thermal high above. "When you are hunted your entire life," she said, her voice low and devoid of self-pity, "you learn the ways of the prey. You learn to think not about where you are going, but about where your hunter expects you to be." She turned her head to look at him. In the dim, reflected light of the cave, her face was softer, the hard edges of the warrior softened by weariness. The cut on his cheek, where she had applied the yarrow, was a dull, healing ache. "That life I saw in you," she said. "On the pass, I saw it before. A man who moves like he belongs nowhere. Nowhere's the only place that's ever felt like home." He admitted, the words coming out easier than he expected. He looked down at his own scraped hands. "I've been on one side of a line or the other my whole life. The law, the job, the paycheck. It was always simple. You made it, not simple. The line is a lie," she said. "It is a story the men with fences tell themselves, so they can sleep at night. There is only the living and the dying, the hungry and the fed." They sat in silence again, but it was a different kind of silence now, a shared understanding. The weight of who they were, tracker and fugitive, white man and native, seemed to fall away, leaving only two people, caught in the same impossible situation. He reached into his pocket and his fingers closed around the smooth, cool wolf stone. He pulled it out, looking at the ancient carving in his palm. "This is important to you," she nodded. "It was my mother's. She said the wolf knows all the paths. even the ones in the spirit world. It is a guide, so you do not lose your way in the dark." He held it out to her. "An offering. You should keep it." She looked at the stone in his hand, then at his face. She shook her head. A small, almost imperceptible motion. "No, you keep it. The path ahead of you is darker than mine." The second day was less than 12 hours away. The deadline of their separation loomed over them, an unspoken presence in the small cave. They both knew the odds. Vance was relentless. This was a land of rock slides, rattlesnakes, and bad water. A lone man, even a skilled one, could disappear out here for 1,000 reasons. Ronan looked at her, at the fierce, unbending strength in her eyes, and a feeling he couldn't name took root in his chest. It was a hollow ache of a thing, a premonition of loss. He had to say it. "When this is done," he started, his voice low. "If—" She cut him off, her gaze direct and unflinching. "Do not speak of if." She reached out and her fingers brushed against his hand, the one holding the stone. Her touch was as light as a feather, but it sent a jolt through him. "A promise." "Ronan Pike," she said, her voice a near whisper. "A promise is better than a hope. If we live, we will meet again. At the place where the river bends to greet the 3 tall pines. You will know it when you see it." She paused, and her dark eyes held a deep, sorrowful light. "And if we die, the wolf stone will show you the way." He closed his hand around the stone, her promise sealed with it. It was not a declaration of love. It was something harder, deeper, and more real. It was a pact made on the edge of the world, an anchor in a sea of uncertainty. As night fell, a new kind of chaos erupted. They were watching the posse's distant campfire, a single orange spark in the vast darkness. When they saw it, a second group of riders, emerging from a side canyon, moving without lights, silent and fast. They hit Vance's camp like a flash flood. Muzzle flashes strobed in the dark, frantic and scattered. The night was torn apart by the sound of gunfire, the screams of men and horses. It wasn't a planned military assault. It was a messy, brutal raid. Opportunists, drifters, or a rival outfit, drawn by the prospect of fresh horses and supplies. The kind of lawless scavengers that thrived in the spaces between civilization and the wilderness. "Now," Tala whispered, her voice cutting through the din. The ambush was a disaster for Vance, but it was a gift to them, a perfect distraction. She led him not down, but up. They scrambled out of the back of the alcove and onto a goat trail that seemed to be plastered vertically onto the cliff face. They climbed in the darkness, the sounds of the firefight fading below them. Ronan could feel the stone wolf pressing against his leg, a solid, real thing in a world that had dissolved into chaos. High above, the cold, indifferent light of the stars seemed to scrape across the sharp edges of the rock, lighting their impossible path to escape. The dawn of the second day broke on a scene of utter exhaustion. Their horses were spent, their heads hanging low, their sides slick with sweat. They stumbled on the rocky terrain, their strength finally giving out. They were forced to dismount and continue on foot, leading the weary animals. The relentless pace had taken its toll. They walked in silence, the 2-day limit pressing down on them. Every step was a step closer to their separation. Around mid-morning, they reached the crest of a high, wind-swept mesa. Tala stopped. "This is it," she said, her voice flat. "From here, you go west, toward the Broken Buttes. It is rough country. You can lose an army in there. I must turn back. The 2 days are over." It was as simple and as brutal as that. The pact was fulfilled. She had guided him. Now, he was on his own. He turned to face her. There were 1,000 things to say, but none of the words would come. He looked at her tired, dust-streaked face and the unyielding strength in her eyes. He simply nodded. She reached out and placed a hand on his horse's neck. A final, gentle gesture. "Ride hard, Ronan Pike, and do not lose the way." She turned, swung herself into her saddle with a weary grace, and without a backward glance, rode away, a lone figure disappearing back into the labyrinth of canyons. Ronan stood and watched until she was gone. He was alone, with an exhausted horse, a copper mask, and a promise. He turned west, toward the jagged teeth of the buttes on the horizon. He knew Vance's posse was shattered and disorganized. But Vance himself was not a man to quit. He would be coming, angrier and more determined than ever, and he would no longer be fooled by the simple trick of a visible trail. The real hunt was about to begin. The end came not with a bang, but with the sickening crack of bone. Ronan's horse, pushed beyond the limits of endurance, stepped into a covered badger hole on a steep descent. A sharp, piercing scream of pain tore from the animal's throat as its forelegs snapped. The horse went down in a chaotic heap. Throwing Ronan clear, he hit the ground hard, the impact jarring every bone in his body, and rolled to a stop in a cloud of red dust. He was on his feet in an instant, his own pain a distant thrumming. The horse was struggling, trying to rise, its eyes wide with terror and agony. Ronan drew his Colt, his face a grim mask. There was only one mercy for a wound like that in a place like this. He placed the muzzle gently against the horse's head, murmured a final, quiet word of thanks, and pulled the trigger. The sharp report of the pistol was a full stop at the end of a long, hard sentence. He was afoot, alone, and he knew, with the chilling certainty of a hunted man, that the sound of that shot was a dinner bell for the wolves that were chasing him. He stripped the saddlebags and the waterskin from the dead horse, slung them over his shoulder, and began to climb. His only hope was the high ground, a jagged spine of rock that clawed at the sky. The ascent was a brutal, lung-searing agony. The rocks were sharp, tearing at his hands and the worn leather of his boots. He moved with a desperate, animal urgency, fueled by the last dregs of his adrenaline. He did not look back. He did not need to. He could feel the pursuit, a cold weight on the back of his neck. He reached the summit as the sun began its long, slow bleed toward the horizon. He collapsed behind a cluster of granite boulders, his chest heaving, his body screaming in protest. He was trapped. The ridge offered a commanding view, but it was a dead end, with sheer cliffs dropping away on three sides. He risked a look over the edge, and he saw them, Vance and 5 other men, picking their way up the trail he had just made. They moved with a renewed purpose, like hounds that had finally cornered their quarry. But then Ronan's blood ran cold. Vance had stopped. He wasn't looking up at Ronan's position. He was staring past the ridge, into the deep, protected valley to the north. He raised a hand, pointing. Ronan followed his gaze. In the clear, still air of the late afternoon, he could see it. A faint, almost invisible wisp of blue-gray smoke, rising from the distant pines. The smoke from the camp's cooking fires. He had failed. In his desperate flight, he had led them here. He had led them to the very sanctuary he had promised to protect. A cold, hollow feeling settled in his gut, a grief heavier than any exhaustion. Vance's head snapped back around, his gaze locking onto Ronan's position. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across his dust-caked face. He had won. He had found the nest. Nowhere left to run. Pike Vance's voice was a grating yell, carried on the wind. "It's over. Throw down your weapon and get on your knees." Ronan didn't move. He leaned his back against the cold, solid granite. He could hear Vance's men spreading out, their boots crunching on the gravel as they formed a semicircle below him, cutting off any conceivable escape. He was out of time, out of options. He reached into his pocket, and his fingers closed around the smooth, familiar shape of the wolf stone. He pulled it out, its dark, carved surface a comfort in his palm. He thought of Tala, of her promise. He thought of the quiet dignity of Neosi and the fierce, desperate hope in the eyes of the young warriors. He had chosen to stand with the hungry. "I said on your knees. You traitorous scum," Vance bellowed, his rifle now leveled at Ronan's chest. Ronan looked down at the lawman. He looked at the smoking rifle barrels of the posse, and a slow, tired smile touched his lips. It was not a smile of mirth. It was a smile of acceptance, of peace. He had lived a life with no allegiance, a ghost on the empty plains. But here, at the end, he had found something to stand for, something worth the price. He raised his head and met Vance's furious gaze. "Worth it," he whispered to the wind. And then, a sound. It was not loud. It was a soft, sibilant whisper, like a dry wind sweeping through autumn leaves. It came from the north, from the mouth of the valley. A flicker of movement, then another. Vance and his men heard it too. They turned, their rifles shifting, their triumphant expressions souring into confusion and then alarm. From the trees, they emerged, a dozen riders, then 24. They flowed out of the valley not with a thunderous charge, but with a terrifying, unified silence. They were ghosts of horse and leather, their faces grim, their bows already drawn. Arrows knocked on the strings. They spread out, forming a wide, silent crescent that mirrored the posse's own, trapping the lawmen between them and the cliff. The world went utterly still. The only sound was the high, lonely cry of the wind. No one moved. No one spoke. It was a tableau of imminent violence, a single spark away from a bloodbath. The click of a rifle hammer being cocked was as loud as a cannon shot in the frozen silence. Then, a single rider detached from the native line and moved forward. It was Tala. She rode a powerful war pony, its flanks painted with symbols of lightning and hail. She carried no rifle, no bow. She held a single unadorned spear, its iron head glinting in the dying sun. She did not charge. She walked her horse calmly, deliberately, into the no-man's land between the two armed groups. She stopped directly in the center, a solitary figure of defiant calm, the fulcrum upon which all their lives now balanced. As she stopped, a ripple of movement went through the warriors behind her. At some unseen signal, their spears, which had been held at their sides, were lifted as one. A forest of iron points rose into the air, a silent, unified gesture of solidarity and resolve. They were not aiming at Vance. They were honoring their champion, pledging their lives to the choice she was about to make. From the valley behind them, another group appeared. Chief Nyosi, Atsidi, and the other elders, their faces grim. They had come to bear witness. Tala's gaze was a physical force. She looked first at Deputy Vance, her eyes holding his with an icy, contemptuous fire. She held his gaze for a long moment, letting him feel the full weight of her presence, of the lethal force she held in check behind her. Then, slowly, she turned her head and looked at the council, at her father. Her expression softened, but only for a heartbeat. It was not a plea for permission. It was a demand for faith. Finally, she looked up at the ridge, at Ronan. He was still standing, the wolfstone clutched in his hand. Their eyes met across the impossible distance. And in that look, the promise they had made in the dark of the cave was reaffirmed. She turned her face forward again, looking at nothing and everything. She drew a deep breath. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it possessed a resonant clarity that cut through the wind and struck the heart of every person there. It was as sharp and pure as the striking of a bell. She said 4 words, "He rides with me." The echo of the phrase, the same 4 words that had saved him once before, hung in the air, imbued now with the full weight of their shared journey, of their sacrifices, of their promise. For a moment, nothing happened. The tension remained, a drawn bowstring. Nyosi's face was unreadable, a mask of stone. Then, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. As one. The circle of spears around Tala was lowered. The movement was a single, fluid wave, a sigh of wind passing through a field of wheat. The iron points dipped toward the earth. The judgment was made. The tribe had spoken through its daughter, and the chief had affirmed it. Ronan Pike was no longer an outsider. He was one of them. Vance watched, his face a contorted mask of rage and disbelief. He had been beaten, but not by bullets or blades. He had been defeated by a logic he could not comprehend, by a unity he could never hope to break. He was a lawman with 5 men, facing a small army and a moral authority that was as old as the mountains themselves. To open fire now would be an act of outright slaughter, a line even he could not cross. He spat on the ground, a gesture of pure, impotent fury. "This ain't over," he snarled, his voice a venomous rasp. But there was no conviction in it. He had been outmaneuvered, outclassed, and utterly humiliated. Without another word, he wrenched his horse's head around and, with his men falling in behind him, rode away. They did not look back. Their retreat was a messy, shameful thing, the ignominious end to a hunt that had cost them everything and gained them nothing. The wind swept across the ridge, carrying away the dust of their departure. The silence that fell was profound, a quiet born not of tension, but of relief and a deep, unspoken uncertainty. The immediate danger had passed. Ronan was alive. The camp was safe. The 4 words had worked their magic, turning the tide of fate. But as he looked down from his lonely perch at the warriors below, at the woman on the war pony who had claimed him, he knew the truth. Speaking the words had been the easy part. Living them would be another matter entirely. To stay meant more than simply not leaving. What did it mean to belong? The conditions of Ronan's new life were laid out not as a welcome, but as a contract, spoken by Neosi in the quiet, serious atmosphere of the council circle the following day. There was no celebration of their victory over Vance, only a sober acknowledgement of a temporary reprieve. "You have earned your life," the chief said, his gaze as steady and deep as a river. "But a life spared is not a life earned. To stay among us is to become one of us. You will work, you will learn our laws, and you will learn our tongue, so you can understand the truths we speak." It was a triad of demands of the body, the mind, and the spirit. There was no room for negotiation, and so Ronan's education began. The first lessons were taught by muscle and sweat. The tracker's hands, accustomed to the smooth leather of reins and the cold steel of a gun, were reshaped by harder, more fundamental work. He was given an axe, and he learned the art of splitting pine and juniper, the satisfying thud of the blade, the sharp, clean scent of sap that clung to his clothes and hair. He learned to read the grain of the wood, to see the knots and twists before the blade struck, a new kind of tracking. He worked alongside the women, scraping hides until they were supple and clean, a painstaking, arm-burning task. He learned to cure meat, smoking long strips of venison over a low, smoldering fire until it was as tough and dark as old leather, the food that would sustain them through the lean months. He sat with the old men, his hands clumsy and slow, learning to mend a broken saddle cinch, to stitch a tear in a worn moccasin, his thick fingers fumbling with the awl and sinew. His hands, once pale under their coat of trail dust, blistered. The blisters broke, raw and painful, and he kept working. In time, the raw skin healed into a new layer, thick and hard. The calluses were a map of his new life, a testament written on his own skin. He was shedding the man he had been, one painful layer at a time. The young warriors, who had once looked at him with open hostility, now watched him with a grudging, silent respect. He did not complain. He did not shirk. He simply worked. His second education was at the hands of Tala. She became his teacher in the language of the land, a tongue he had only partially understood. She taught him not with words, but with gestures, by pointing to the world around them. She taught him to read the sky. A wisp of a cloud like a horse's tail meant wind was coming. Clouds with flat bottoms meant rain, but rain that would respect the boundaries of the high ridges. She taught him the subtle shifts in the wind, the way a breeze from the east carried the heavy, wet scent of a distant storm, while a wind from the south was dry and spoke of thirst. He learned the names of the plants, not just the yarrow that had soothed his wound, but the bitter root for strength, the sage for cleansing, and the small, tough berries that could sustain a man for days. It was a knowledge far deeper than the simple tracking of hoofprints. It was the knowledge of how to live with the land, not just on it. Their lessons were quiet, conducted on the edges of the bustling camp. In these moments, the fierce warrior she was fell away, replaced by a patient, focused teacher, and the hard, solitary man he had been began to soften, to learn the forgotten art of listening. But the world outside their hidden valley did not sleep. The news came in whispers. carried by the scouts who moved like shadows along the ridges. The reports were always the same, a slow, steady tightening of the noose. Vance had not given up. He had regrouped, his humiliation hardening into a cold, obsessive resolve. He was seen patrolling the lowlands, a constant, menacing presence. Jedediah Thorne's ranchers were pushing their herds further into the high country, claiming more of the grasslands. A scout reported the digging of a new well near the sunken spring, a stake driven into the heart of what had once been Uplanders' territory. Each piece of news was a reminder that their peace was a fragile, temporary thing, a small island in a rising tide of encroachment. One afternoon, as Ronan was mending a bridle, Neosi approached him. The chief moved with the silence that was his nature, and Ronan did not notice him until he was standing there, a tall, somber shadow. He did not speak. He held out his hand. In it was a simple cord, braided from the tough, pale fibers of the yucca plant. Ronan stopped his work. His hand still, he understood this was no casual gesture. Neosi took his right wrist and, with slow, deliberate movements, tied the yucca cord around it. The knot was simple but strong. The cord was rough against Ronan's skin. It was not a decoration. It was a mark, a brand. It was a public declaration, more powerful than any words, that he was no longer a stranger. He had chosen a side, and that choice was now visible for all to see. Ronan looked from the cord on his wrist to the chief's ancient, weary eyes, and he gave a single, solemn nod. A debt had been paid. A new one had been accepted. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, the fire at the center of the camp burned brighter. In the evenings, the people would gather, and the elders would speak. Ronan, sitting on the outside of the circle, began to understand more of their language. He listened as they told the old stories, the stories of the creation of the world, of the coyote trickster, and of the long, epic journeys of their ancestors, the ones who had first carved the symbols in the lava tube. The voices of the old ones were cracked and dry, like the riverbeds in summer, but their stories were a living water, nourishing the roots of their people. Ronan listened like a child, discovering the history of a family he had never known he was missing. He was learning not just how to live, but why. One evening, he and Tala stood on a high, rocky ledge overlooking the valley. The sun had set, and the sky was a deep, impossible violet, the first stars just beginning to prick the darkness. Below them, the campfires were small, warm sparks of orange. A gentle breeze sighed through the pines, carrying the scent of smoke and the vast, clean emptiness of the high desert. "It is a kind of peace," Ronan said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the vastness. "It is a home without walls," Tala replied, her gaze on the horizon. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the stars bloom in the deepening night. They were no longer the adversaries from Dagger Pass, nor simply the teacher and student. A new, unspoken understanding had grown between them, a bond forged in shared danger and quiet respect. "Vance will not stop," Ronan said, stating the hard truth that always lingered at the edge of their peace. "Thorne will not stop. This life, it will not be easy." Tala turned to look at him, her face a pale oval in the starlight. "I have never known an easy day. Ronan Pike, we do not ask for easy. We ask only for a place to be, a place to live as we were meant to live." She paused, her dark eyes searching his. "The future will not be a romance. There will be loss. There will be hard choices. We will sacrifice, and we will hurt. I will not promise you a life of peace. I'm not looking for a promise of peace," he said, his voice a low rumble. He looked out at the valley, at the scattered fires that represented her people. "I'm just looking for a life that matters." He met her gaze, and whatever comes, we will carry the weight of it together. It was not a passionate declaration. It was a quiet, solid agreement, a foundation of stone upon which something real and lasting could be built. As they stood there, a new sound drifted up from the valley below. It was a low, resonant beat, the steady, rhythmic pulse of a large drum. Thump, 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 thump. It was a sound of purpose, a sound of movement. "The season is turning," Tala said. "It is time to move, to follow the game to the winter grounds. The drumbeat was a summons. The long journey was about to begin. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with hardship and the constant threat of their enemies. But as Ronan stood there on the ledge, with the yucca cord on his wrist, the wolf stone in his pocket, and Tala by his side, his heart, for the first time in his life, was not restless. The road was long, but his soul was finally at rest. He had found his place, those 4 words, spoken in the desperate firelight of a judgment circle, had not just saved a life. They had taken a man who belonged nowhere and put a new life, a new purpose, in the saddle. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know where in the world you're listening from. Please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you really enjoyed it, supporting us by hitting the hype button helps our stories reach even more listeners.